The camera fades in through rain. A convoy creeps along a broken German road in spring 1945. Tires grinding through mud, headlights shrouded under blackout paint. In the back of a U.S. Army medical truck sit 4 women in tattered gray uniforms, their hands folded in their laps. Their eyes are hollow, uniforms stripped of insignia. The war is over, but they have not yet believed it. Outside, the countryside is scarred. Barns collapsed, fields cratered, trees split like matchsticks. A faint church bell tolls from somewhere deep in the ruins. One of the women, Ingrid Keller, a nurse from Hamburg, stares at the bandages wrapped around her own wrist. The bloodstain has dried into rust. Across from her, an American sergeant with a bandaged cheek offers her a canteen. She hesitates. He nods once as if to say, "You can trust me." When she finally drinks, the metallic taste of the water feels like the first real thing she's tasted in months. No orders, no slogans, just water and silence. As the truck stops at a makeshift field hospital on the outskirts of Frankfurt, she steps down into mud, expecting commands, suspicion, perhaps a guard with a rifle. Instead, a young American lieutenant looks up from a clipboard and says, "Welcome, Nurse Keller. We could use your help." The words strike her like a bullet made of mercy. For the first time since the war began, someone had spoken to her not as enemy, not as prisoner, but as nurse. And in that small moment, in a land still breathing smoke, the war's strangest miracle begins. Enemies choosing to heal together. The hospital was built inside the shell of a bombed factory. The roof was patched with canvas, the windows replaced with gauze. At dawn, the fog rolled in from the main river and curled through the corridors like pale smoke. The Americans had taken over the site weeks earlier, turning it into a joint medical outpost for civilians, displaced persons, and the wounded from both sides. Its sign read simply, Allied Field Hospital 43C. Inside, the smell was a blend of disinfectant, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of decay. Generators hummed somewhere beyond the walls. Cots lined the floor in endless rows. Men in torn uniforms, children with hollow eyes, women clutching infants wrapped in rags. And among them, moving like ghosts in white aprons, were the nurses, American, British, Polish, and now, impossibly, German. Ingrid had been assigned to Ward 7, under the supervision of Captain Eleanor Whitman, a tall New Englander whose voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen too much and still refused to break. The first time Whitman handed Ingrid a tray of scalpels and said, "Sterilize these," Ingrid froze. For months she had been treated as a war criminal, stripped of instruments, accused of cruelty for simply surviving in uniform. She looked at the shining steel, then at Whitman's calm eyes. "Are you not afraid?" she asked. Whitman shrugged. "If I'm afraid of you, I can't expect you to save my men." That day Ingrid scrubbed until her fingers bled. Every swab, every bandage was a prayer whispered through guilt. The other German nurses, Lotte Brandt, Eva Seidel, and Martha Grun, worked beside her in silence. They still wore their gray skirts, but the eagle patches had been torn away, leaving ragged outlines like ghosts of obedience. Whenever an American orderly passed, they lowered their eyes. But the orderlies, weary and shivering, soon began to nod in greeting. By nightfall, they were trading cigarettes for advice on suturing. War had taught them suspicion. Exhaustion taught them something else. In the evenings, when the patients slept and the rain beat against the tarpaulin roof, Ingrid would sit by the lantern and study the instruments laid before her. Forceps, scalpels, a stethoscope etched with U.S. Army medical depth. She remembered the day in 1943 when she'd received her first kit from the Reich Ministry of Health. Everything stamped with the Black Eagle. Everything perfect and cold. Back then, she had believed medicine was a duty to the state. Now, as she polished the American stethoscope, she realized it was a duty to the living. One night, Captain Whitman entered quietly. Her sleeves were rolled up, her face drawn from another 16-hour shift. She sat opposite Ingrid and poured 2 tin cups of coffee. "I hear you were in Hamburg during the firestorm," she said. Ingrid nodded. "I was in the cellars. I tried to treat children burned by phosphorus. They screamed until their throats were gone." Whitman looked down. "My unit was bombing rail targets that week. I suppose none of us left Hamburg untouched." The silence between them was heavier than the smell of smoke still trapped in their clothes. Finally, Whitman said, "If you can live with that memory, you can live with me." By early summer, the hospital had become a fragile miracle of cooperation. Americans brought supplies: morphine, bandages, powdered milk, while the German nurses organized the wards with ruthless efficiency. Ingrid created a rotation schedule so precise that the U.S. staff began calling her clockwork. Patients noticed. A Polish boy with a shattered leg told a journalist, "Here everyone speaks different languages, but they all sound like comfort." Yet the trust was not complete. Some officers in command worried about sabotage. A major from headquarters arrived one afternoon and demanded a report. When he saw German women handling syringes, he barked, "Who authorized this?" Whitman replied, "I did, because they save lives faster than paperwork." The major scowled. But when an explosion rocked the outer wing moments later, a leftover mine detonating nearby, it was Ingrid who rushed into the smoke, dragging out 2 wounded engineers with her bare hands. The major saluted her without words. The next morning, he signed a memo allowing the Germans full access to medical supplies. That night, Ingrid cried for the first time in years. Not from grief, but from the unbearable weight of being trusted. The next day, she gathered her team around a table covered in gauze. "From now on," she told them, "we work as if the world depends on our steadiness, because perhaps it does." They nodded, their faces still pale but their eyes alive. Lotta cracked a small smile. "I thought I'd never see an American hand me a scalpel," she said. Ava added, "Or that we'd be trusted not to use it the wrong way." They laughed. The dry, astonished laughter of people rediscovering humanity. In the weeks that followed, the hospital became a small republic of healing. Meals were shared, jokes traded, birthdays celebrated with salvaged chocolate. When a typhus outbreak swept through a refugee camp nearby, Ingrid led the inoculation team. 3 Americans, 2 Germans, 1 Polish nun. They worked 40 hours without sleep. After the last child was treated, Ingrid collapsed on the steps, her hands trembling. Whitman knelt beside her, pressing a metal-shaped patch into her palm. "Consider it borrowed," she said. "We don't give out medals anymore. We give out trust." Still, the ghosts of allegiance lingered. One night, Marta, the youngest, was found sobbing in the laundry. She had discovered her brother's name on a list of executed SS medics. "I thought if I kept healing people, God would forgive us," she whispered. Ingrid held her tightly. "Maybe he already has," she said. "Maybe that's why we're still breathing." By autumn, the first civilians returned to Frankfurt. Mothers queued for vaccinations. Men came searching for lost relatives. The line outside the hospital never ended. One afternoon, an old woman arrived carrying a wicker basket. She approached Ingrid and offered a loaf of dark bread. "I heard there are nurses here who heal without asking names," she said. Ingrid accepted it with both hands. That night, the staff shared the bread at dinner, breaking it into pieces like communion. No one spoke, but every bite tasted like absolution. When the first snow fell, word spread that the hospital was to be turned over to the new German civil authorities. Many feared the Americans would leave and take their trust with them. Instead, Captain Whitman assembled everyone in the courtyard. "We're transferring equipment to local control," she announced, "and that means you'll be responsible for it." The German nurses looked at each other in disbelief. For years, they had been told they were unworthy even of freedom. Now crates of American medical instruments, sterile, gleaming, wrapped in oilcloth, were being signed over to their care. Whitman handed Ingrid the manifest. Her name, written in ink at the bottom, looked unreal. As she held the clipboard, Ingrid realized that this was more than inventory. It was a ceremony of faith. The instruments weren't just tools. They were proof that compassion could cross the ruins of ideology. The other nurses stood silently, their breath turning white in the cold air, as Whitman said, "Take care of them as you would your patients. They belong to everyone now." That night, long after the others had gone to bed, Ingrid walked through the silent wards. Lanterns flickered on steel tables, reflecting the shapes of scissors and syringes. She ran her fingers along the instruments, feeling their chill. Each one seemed to hum with invisible memory, the pulse of every life saved, every wound closed. She whispered to the darkness, "You trusted us." The words felt like a vow. Outside, snowflakes drifted through a hole in the roof, melting on her hands like forgiveness made visible. When dawn came, she wrote a letter to her mother in Hamburg. "I am working for Americans now," she began. They treat us as if we never belonged to the Reich, as if healing erases borders. I did not believe such things existed. Now I do. She sealed the letter, unsure if the postal service even functioned, but she kept a copy folded in her apron pocket. Years later, it would be found there, edges worn soft by touch. The spring thaw of 1946 came like a resurrection. Snow melted into rivers that carried ash and memories toward the Rhine. The hospital without a flag still stood, patched, weary, alive. Its canvas roof had been replaced with corrugated tin, its wards expanded with salvaged lumber. Outside, the ruins of Frankfurt buzzed faintly with rebuilding. Men pushing carts, women laying bricks, children shouting in the distance, their laughter echoing through bombed-out walls like birds testing the sky. Inside, the nurses worked as if dawn itself depended on their steadiness. The Americans were preparing to rotate home. Captain Whitman had been reassigned to Nuremberg to help the War Crimes Tribunal's medical teams. Before leaving, she gathered her German nurses in the corridor. Her voice, as always, was crisp but kind. "You've earned this," she said, holding out a ledger. "From now on, this hospital belongs to you. Make it a place where trust can't die." The women stood silent, unable to answer. When Whitman shook their hands one by one, Ingrid felt something she had forgotten the shape of. Belonging. The captain pressed a small, worn medallion into her palm, a St. Luke pendant, patron of physicians. "For luck," she said, "and to remind you, medicine is older than any army." After Whitman left, the silence felt enormous. The Americans took their flags, their trucks, and their discipline with them, but they left something invisible behind. A code unwritten but binding: do no harm. Do not hate. Ingrid assumed leadership quietly. She refused titles, insisting she was still only a nurse. Yet everyone deferred to her. The Polish nun, Sister Helena, the Dutch volunteer Cornelia, even the French medic Etienne, who limped on a cane and still carried fragments of shrapnel in his thigh. Together they built a rhythm of survival. Every morning at dawn, Ingrid unlocked the supply shed and inventoried the precious crates stamped U.S. Army Medical Department. Every evening she locked them again, counting instruments by touch, not out of mistrust but reverence. Those tools had been given to them freely. To misuse them would feel like betrayal. The work never stopped. Refugees arrived from the east, skeletal and trembling. Trainloads of displaced children were offloaded near the rail yard, wrapped in army blankets, eyes blank from hunger. The nurses moved among them like angels without wings, washing, feeding, cutting hair, delousing, disinfecting, holding tiny bodies through fever and delirium. Each case was another fragment of a shattered world. Each recovery a thread in a fragile tapestry of peace. But peace, like medicine, required constant care. One evening in March, a truck rolled into the courtyard bearing a red cross hastily painted over a swastika. The driver, a German in a Wehrmacht overcoat, staggered out. "Supplies from a depot near Fulda," he gasped. In the truck bed lay crates of medical tools seized from abandoned field hospitals: scalpels, bone saws, morphine vials. Some were still stamped with the eagle and cross. The sight made the nurses recoil. Marta whispered, "These were used on soldiers, maybe on prisoners." Ingrid stood silent, staring at the instruments. Their shine felt obscene, like mirrors reflecting a crime. Finally, she said, "We'll clean them." Lotta protested, "But they're from the camps." Ingrid replied softly, "Then let them heal what they once hurt." They boiled the tools all night in great pots of water, steam rising like ghosts into the rafters. The stench of disinfectant mingled with memories none of them wanted. At dawn, Ingrid laid the sterilized instruments beside the American ones. Two worlds, once enemies, now shared a single tray of steel. She whispered a silent oath. Never again for harm. The months that followed were an unbroken blur of exhaustion and quiet triumph. In the pediatric ward, Lotta devised a way to stretch a single vial of penicillin across 5 children by alternating doses. In the surgical tent, Etienne improvised a blood transfusion system using bicycle tubing and an American glass bottle. Sister Helena taught hymns to children too young to remember any language but crying. By midsummer, rumors spread that the Allied authorities were sending inspectors. Many feared the hospital would be shut down, its staff scattered. Ingrid prepared her records meticulously: patient logs, inventory, ration charts. When the inspectors arrived, 3 men in khaki with clipboards, They walked the wards with bureaucratic precision. One asked in clipped English, "You're the acting supervisor?" Ingrid nodded. "Where did you get this equipment?" "From the Americans," she said simply. "They trusted us." The man raised an eyebrow. "And it's still all here?" She gestured to the shelves, gleaming with neatly labeled tools. Every piece they left without comment. A week later, a telegram arrived. Field Hospital 43C authorized for continued operation under German civilian administration. It was the first such order in the region. That night the nurses celebrated with coffee brewed from roasted barley, laughing for the first time without guilt. The war had taken their pride. Trust had given them dignity. Ingrid's leadership was tested again that autumn. A train derailed near Kassel, carrying wounded former prisoners of war, Russians, Poles, French. The Allied command ordered her hospital to receive them. But among the injured were also German guards who had been escorting them home. The nurses hesitated. Sister Helena whispered, "Do we treat them too?" Ingrid's answer was quiet but absolute. "If we choose who deserves healing, we are no better than what we escaped." For 3 days and nights they worked without sleep. In one ward, a Russian amputee reached out with his remaining hand to help a German guard drink water. The nurses watched in silence, tears blurring their vision. When the Russian later died, Ingrid placed his hand over his heart and whispered, "Forgive us all." Word of their impartial mercy spread. British correspondents came, photographing the hospital for newspapers. One article called it "The Place Without Flags." The headline embarrassed Ingrid but drew aid from abroad. Bandages from London, vitamins from Canada, powdered milk from Switzerland. For the first time since 1939, supplies arrived bearing no emblem of empire or vengeance, only the Red Cross and a single word: humanitarian. Still, the past waited in the shadows. One cold November night, a stranger arrived, an American officer in civilian clothes, his left arm missing. "Captain Whitman sent me," he said, handing Ingrid a letter. It was brief. "I hear you kept your promise. That's all the victory we needed." The man lingered, watching her work. "You were the enemy," he said softly. "And yet you saved more Americans here than I did in combat." She replied, "War makes enemies. Healing ends them." He smiled faintly, removed a small parcel from his coat and left it on the table. Inside was a new stethoscope, engraved simply, "For Ingrid, from those you taught to trust." That night she walked through the sleeping wards, listening through that stethoscope to the heartbeats of soldiers, refugees, and children. Each beat sounded like the same word in a language older than hatred: alive. Winter returned with hunger. Food rations were cut, coal scarce. Patients huddled under blankets as frost crept across window panes. Yet even in the cold, the hospital pulsed with quiet purpose. When the power failed, they performed operations by candlelight. When the last bar of soap ran out, they boiled herbs for disinfectant. When despair threatened to choke them, they sang. Their voices rose through the rafters, German lullabies mingling with English hymns and Polish prayers, a choir of the broken made whole. In late January, Ingrid fell ill with pneumonia. For days she drifted between fever dreams, bomb sirens turning to church bells, the roar of firestorms to applause. When she woke, she found herself surrounded by her nurses. "You gave us the tools," Lotta said. "Now let us use them." They tended her with the same devotion she had shown them all. When she finally stood again, weak but smiling, she whispered, "Then the Americans were right to trust us." The phrase spread through the staff like a benediction. The Americans trusted us. It became the unofficial motto of the hospital, written above the supply door in chalk. Each time a nurse reached for an instrument, she touched those words, a promise renewed with every bandage tied, every life saved. By the spring of 1947, the hospital had grown beyond its walls. Field clinics sprouted in nearby towns, run by women who had once believed their purpose ended with defeat. Now they carried their lessons outward, teaching others how to heal with humility. Some joined the newly formed Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, others worked with Allied relief agencies, but all carried the same invisible inheritance: trust given, trust returned. Ingrid often visited the children's ward, where a new generation played among rows of cots. One afternoon she found a small boy drawing on a scrap of paper, a circle with two hands shaking inside it. "What's that?" she asked. The boy replied, "It's the flag of our hospital." She smiled through tears. "Keep drawing it," she said. "The world will need that flag." At sunset, she climbed the stairs to the roof where the sky glowed over the ruins. The city was rebuilding, cranes rising where flak towers once stood, bells ringing again in churches. She held the stethoscope Whitman's man had given her, pressed it to her own heart, and listened. The beat was steady. Forgiveness had a rhythm, she realized, not sudden but enduring. The year was 1948, and Germany was learning to breathe again, shallow, uncertain breaths, like a patient waking from a long coma. The rubble that had once swallowed entire streets now formed the foundations of new walls. Trains began to run, again, their whistles trembling through valleys still haunted by silence. Yet beneath the rhythm of rebuilding, old shadows stirred, questions that medicine could not bandage. For Ingrid Keller and her nurses, the Allied Field Hospital 43C had become both sanctuary and burden. They had saved hundreds, perhaps thousands. But the more they healed, the more they were forced to confront what they had once ignored. The ghosts of the oath they had sworn under the Reich, when healing had been twisted into hierarchy. Ingrid kept the American stethoscope on her desk, its metal catching the weak morning light. Each time she looked at it, she remembered Captain Whitman's voice. Medicine is older than any army. Yet sometimes, as she passed the surgical ward and saw the scars on patients' arms, inked numbers, burn marks, bones reset by brutality, she wondered if medicine could truly be innocent. That spring, a letter arrived from Nuremberg. The return address carried a name that froze her. Dr. Karl Brandt, once Hitler's personal physician, now awaiting execution for crimes against humanity. Inside was a copy of his final appeal, a public statement defending the ethics of necessity in wartime medicine. The letter had been circulated to hospitals as a warning of how far duty could fall. Ingrid read it twice, then burned it over a candle. The flame hissed, curling his words into ash. Still, the smell lingered, acrid and accusing. Later that week, the hospital received a new shipment of patients, survivors of medical experiments from Ravensbrück. Women, German women. One of them, Anna Vollmer, had been a nurse before the war. She lay on the stretcher like a ghost, her legs twisted by crude surgeries. When Ingrid read her intake file, her hands trembled. Under occupation, it said simply, "Nurse, arrested 1944 for resistance activity." Ingrid stood over her bed, struggling for words. Anna opened her eyes and whispered, "Do I still count as German?" "Yes," Ingrid said softly. "And as human." "Then promise me something." Anna rasped. "Never let another nurse say she didn't know." Those words carved themselves into Ingrid's mind like scripture. That night she gathered her staff in the ward. The lamps flickered. Wind howled through broken panes. "We took an oath once," she began, "but we forgot who it was for. We will take it again tonight, not to a flag, not to a leader, but to the living." Each woman placed her hand on the table, palm open. Ingrid spoke slowly. "Do no harm, not because it is ordered, but because it is right." The others repeated it, their voices trembling but clear. The sound filled the room like prayer. In the following months, the oath began to change them. They refused to segregate patients by nationality or creed. They opened a clinic for displaced children, treating the sons and daughters of both prisoners and soldiers. The Allied command noticed. A colonel from the Public Health Division visited, observing quietly as Ingrid supervised a vaccination drive. He asked, "What drives you now, Nurse Keller?" She looked at him with tired eyes. "The need to feel clean again," she said. The colonel wrote that down in his notebook, perhaps not understanding its weight, yet healing had its enemies. One afternoon, Ingrid found graffiti scrawled across the hospital gate. "Traitors of the fatherland." Someone had thrown a broken bottle through the window of the ward. The townsfolk whispered that these women were working for the occupiers, selling German honor for American supplies. When Ingrid went to the police, the officer shrugged. People are hungry. They need someone to hate. Then hate me, she said, and walked away. That night she found Lotta in tears, clutching the graffiti-smeared plank torn from the gate. Why do they despise us for helping? Lotta asked. Ingrid replied, because mercy looks like surrender to those who only know power. The next crisis came quietly. A train from Dresden arrived with dozens of typhoid cases. Among them was a young man in tattered uniform, delirious and muttering Nazi slogans. When they removed his jacket, Ingrid saw the SS runes tattooed on his arm. Marta hesitated. Should we really treat him? She whispered. Ingrid took the syringe from her hands. Yes, because we are not him. She injected the serum gently into the man's arm, her face expressionless. Later, as he slept, she sat by his cot and wondered if redemption could be transfused like blood, given freely, even to those who never asked. Days later, the man awoke and stared at her. Why didn't you let me die? He asked. Because dying is easy, she said. Living with what you did, that's harder. He turned his face to the wall and wept silently. In late summer, the Allies established a new medical council to oversee reconstruction. They invited Ingrid to speak in Frankfurt before international delegates. She stood at the podium in her plain gray uniform, no insignia, no medals. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she began. I am not a doctor, she said. I am a nurse who once believed obedience was virtue. The Americans taught me that trust is stronger than fear. They gave us their instruments, and with them, they gave us back our conscience. A murmur rippled through the hall. She continued, if the world is to heal, it must trust again. Not in nations, but in hands. When she finished, the room was silent. Then an elderly British surgeon stood and clapped. Others followed. It was not applause of triumph, but of recognition. That evening, Ingrid returned to the hospital to find her nurses waiting with lanterns. Lotta handed her a paper folded into a triangle. Inside was a single sentence written in English. We trust you too. But trust, like any wound, required tending. That winter, a delegation from the new German Ministry of Health visited to standardize the hospital's practices. The officials wore dark suits, their smiles tight. One of them, a young bureaucrat named Heinrich Müller, spoke politely, but with the cold certainty of authority. Frau Keller, he said, Germany must rebuild its medical prestige. These Allied influences, these American habits, must be regulated. Ingrid replied, if you mean kindness, I won't regulate that. Müller frowned. The people need order, not sentiment. She looked him in the eye. Then you learned nothing from the ruins outside. He left without shaking her hand. Weeks later, funding was cut. Supplies dwindled. Yet the nurses refused to close their doors. They scavenged herbs for antiseptics, recycled bandages, melted snow for sterilization. Each act of care became defiance. In March 1949, tragedy struck. Sister Helena contracted tuberculosis while treating refugees in the barracks outside town. She refused to be isolated, insisting, my patients need to see I am not afraid. Within weeks, she was gone. Her death broke something in them. During her burial, snow fell softly over the cemetery, covering her wooden cross. Ingrid placed the St. Luke medallion Whitman had given her atop the grave. You carried faith farther than any uniform, she whispered. That night, alone in her quarters, Ingrid lit a candle and read from her old training manual. The words of the Hippocratic Oath stared back at her, but now they felt different, alive again. She took out a notebook and began writing her own version, line by line. I will serve life, not systems. I will not fear the wounded, even when they are my enemies. I will remember that trust once given must be protected more carefully than blood. She closed the notebook, sealing it with tears. Months later, she was summoned to Berlin to assist in establishing the new National Nursing Council, and the city was still divided, Soviet flags on one side, American on the other. but the air buzzed with fragile hope. In a crowded meeting room, she found herself seated beside a former Wehrmacht nurse and a Red Army medic. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ingrid extended her hand. "We've all seen too much," she said. "Let's build something that doesn't need uniforms." That handshake marked the birth of the German League of Medical Ethics, one of the first cross-national humanitarian organizations of post-war Europe. Its emblem was not an eagle or a star, but two open hands beneath a cross made of light. The motto, suggested by Ingrid herself, read, "Trust given, trust kept." Years later, historians would call that period the Silent Reformation, the time when the healers of the broken world quietly rewrote their own history. But for Ingrid and her nurses, it was not history. It was daily life, washing wounds, changing dressings, calming nightmares. Every gesture was a rebellion against forgetting. On a spring morning in 1950, an American Jeep rolled into the hospital courtyard. The driver was a young lieutenant carrying a crate labeled Medical Donations, Whitman Foundation. He saluted her awkwardly and handed over a letter. It was from Eleanor Whitman herself, now retired. "Dear Ingrid," it read, "if the world forgets how we trusted each other, remind it with your work. That will be the truest monument." Ingrid smiled through tears. She walked to the supply room and placed the letter beside the first American stethoscope, wrapping them together in linen. Then she locked the cabinet. "We'll keep this safe," she told the nurses, "until the world no longer needs reminders." The summer of 1951 arrived quietly, with rain that smelled of new earth instead of smoke. Germany was rebuilding, but its soul was still a patient under observation. Weak pulse, shallow breath, prone to relapse. Across the river, cranes swung over skeletons of concrete, and church bells rang again for weddings instead of funerals.
Yet for those who had lived through the long night, peace felt fragile.
Like a bandage that could come loose if pulled too quickly. Ingrid Keller stood on the hospital roof and watched the river flow beneath her. The water reflected both the sunrise and the ruins that still clung to its banks. It was beautiful in the way only survivors can see beauty, in the tension between what was lost and what still lived. Below, the hospital courtyard was filled with motion. Refugees from the east arrived daily now. Mothers from Silesia, children from the Sudetenland, men limping from Soviet camps. The hospital without a flag had become more than a place of healing. It was a symbol of what Germany wanted to be, compassionate, unarmed, unafraid. Inside, the wards thrummed with new energy. The Red Cross had begun sending international volunteers, Swiss nurses, French doctors, and even 2 Americans fresh from medical school. One of them, Lieutenant James Porter, was barely 25, with a stethoscope slung around his neck and a cautious respect in his eyes. On his first day, he approached Ingrid as she organized the surgical supplies. "Captain Whitman spoke of you," he said softly. "She called you her proof that war can end well." Ingrid smiled faintly, brushing dust from a tray of scalpels. "Proof is a strong word, Lieutenant. Healing is not a victory, it's an obligation." He nodded, understanding more from her tone than her words. From that day forward, he worked under her supervision, eager but humble the way a student watches the hands of a master. And in truth, Ingrid had become one. Her touch steady, her instructions calm, her authority earned not by rank but by endurance. By autumn, the hospital's reputation reached beyond the Allied zones. Requests for assistance came from Austria, the Netherlands, and even the Soviet sector. Despite politics, sickness respected no borders. One morning, a Red Cross envoy arrived from Poland with an urgent message. A typhus outbreak had erupted near Łódź. The Polish hospitals were overwhelmed. "They need trained nurses," the envoy said. "And they need them fast." The room fell silent. For a moment, everyone looked to Ingrid. The word Poland still carried ghosts. The memories of invasion, occupation, and betrayal hung in the air like smoke. Lotta spoke first. "If we go, will they even let us through the border?" Ingrid answered quietly. "If they see we carry medicine instead of rifles, perhaps they'll let us through." 3 days later, they left in a convoy of 2 trucks marked only with red crosses. The road east wound through landscapes that looked older than peace, villages half rebuilt, forests where silence still remembered screams. Crossing into Poland, Ingrid felt the weight of invisible eyes on her. In every face she saw suspicion, grief, and a cautious curiosity. Germans coming not to conquer but to heal. At the camp outside Łódź, the air reeked of sickness and desperation. Rows of tents sagged under the rain. Children lay on straw mats, their bodies fevered, skin blotched. The Polish doctors, exhausted, welcomed the newcomers without ceremony. "If you can work, work," one said simply. And so they did. For days and nights, Ingrid and her nurses moved through the camp like specters of mercy, disinfecting wounds, boiling linens, administering quinine. The first time a Polish mother took Ingrid's hand and whispered, "Dziękuję," Ingrid nearly wept. Gratitude spoken in the language of former enemies felt like absolution. It was there that she met Dr. Alexander Nowak, the camp's lead physician. He was a tall man with sunken eyes, a veteran of Auschwitz who had once been forced to assist in experiments. His left hand trembled slightly as he worked, a permanent reminder of the fractures in his soul. Yet his mind was sharp, his compassion fierce. On the third night, he found Ingrid alone, washing instruments in a tin basin. "You are German," he said, not as accusation but statement. She nodded. "And you still trust me to touch your patients?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Trust is a strange thing. Sometimes it grows best in the ruins. They spoke often after that, about medicine, morality, and the strange endurance of the human spirit. One evening, as lanterns flickered against the canvas walls, he said quietly, "Do you ever feel your hands remember what they once obeyed?" She paused. "Yes," she said, "and that's why I make them obey differently now." He smiled, a tired, haunted smile. Then maybe that's what redemption looks like. When the outbreak finally subsided, dozens of lives had been saved. The Polish authorities held a brief ceremony of thanks, presenting Ingrid and her nurses with handmade ribbons sewn from scrap cloth. "These are not medals," the official said, "only proof that kindness is possible." Ingrid accepted them, tears burning behind her eyes. "We came because we were once trusted," she said. "Now we return that trust to you." When they returned to Frankfurt, the hospital staff greeted them like soldiers home from the front. But Ingrid brought back more than gratitude. She brought a vision. "If we could work with the Poles," she told the council, "then why not with the French, the Czechs, the Russians? Why not build a network where nurses cross borders as easily as disease?" The idea seemed impossible, even naive. Yet the world was shifting. Nations were beginning to talk of unity instead of vengeance. And so in 1952, the European Relief Nursing Corps was born, with Ingrid as one of its founding members. The first meeting was held in Geneva, inside a hall that still smelled faintly of disinfectant and hope. Representatives from 12 countries attended. They spoke in different languages, but their purpose was one. When Ingrid rose to speak, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had rebuilt her soul with her hands. "We were enemies once," she said. "But sickness does not recognize enemies. If we can hold a scalpel together, perhaps we can hold the world together too." The applause that followed was soft, almost reverent, and among those clapping was Dr. Nowak, who had traveled from Poland at her invitation. When their eyes met across the hall, they both understood. The bridge they had built was not made of wood or stone. It was built from trust. That winter, tragedy tested the bridge. Floods struck along the Oder River, sweeping through villages already weak from hunger. The newly formed corps was called to respond. Ingrid led a joint team, Germans, Poles, and French, into the disaster zone. The journey was brutal. Snow, collapsed bridges, fields turned to oceans of mud. But they pressed on. In one village, they found an orphanage half underwater. Children clung to rafters as the current tore through the lower floors. Without hesitation, Ingrid waded in. The water was freezing, rising to her chest. Lotta shouted from the shore, "It's too dangerous." But Ingrid only said, "They trusted us once, we can't stop now." She reached the children one by one, lifting them onto makeshift rafts. When she carried the last child to safety, her lips were blue, her arms trembling. Dr. Nowak wrapped her in a blanket, saying, "You'll kill yourself for strangers." She smiled weakly. "They're not strangers. Not anymore." After the flood, the newspapers carried photographs of the rescue. One image in particular, Ingrid carrying a Polish child through waist-deep water, became famous. For some, it symbolized reconciliation. For others, it reopened old wounds. Letters poured in. Some called her a saint, others a traitor. She ignored them all. The only letter she kept was from an American nurse named Whitman, Eleanor's niece. My aunt always said healing is the bravest rebellion, it read. You've proved her right. As the years passed, Ingrid's hair turned silver, but her hands never lost their steadiness. The hospital thrived, now officially part of the German Red Cross network. Former enemies became colleagues. The past, though never erased, softened around the edges. Yet Ingrid never allowed herself comfort. Each morning she still unlocked the supply room, still counted the instruments one by one. It was not habit, it was ritual. The trust once given by the Americans still lived there, gleaming quietly under glass. In 1955, she was invited to Washington, D.C., to receive a humanitarian award from the International Medical Alliance. It was her first time leaving Europe. As the plane descended, she saw the Potomac glinting in the sun and her heart pounded, not with pride but disbelief. On the stage, beneath bright electric lights, she was introduced simply as a nurse who proved that healing survives war. When she accepted the medal, she said, "Once American soldiers handed me a scalpel and asked me to help them save lives. That single act of trust built everything you see here. I have carried that trust for 10 years and it has never broken." The applause thundered like rain on the tin roof of her old hospital. In that moment, she wished Captain Whitman could have seen it. Later, when a journalist asked her what the medal meant to her, she replied, "It means I have no enemies left to forgive." She returned home quietly, refusing ceremonies. Instead, she gathered her nurses, old faces and new, and placed the medal in the same cabinet as Whitman's letter and the first stethoscope. "This belongs to all of us," she said, "because trust is not a reward, it's a duty." In the years that followed, she traveled across Europe, training new generations of nurses. Wherever she went, she carried with her a small notebook bound in worn leather, the rewritten oath she had composed after Sister Helena's death. She read it aloud at every graduation, her voice steady, her German accented with years of peace. "We will serve life, not systems. We will heal even those who once harmed us. We will remember that every wound closed is one less reason for war." The students would rise, repeating the words after her, and for a moment, the world seemed curable. On a summer evening in 1960, Ingrid walked once more through the courtyard of the hospital she had rebuilt. Children played under the same chestnut trees that had once been splintered by bombs. Nurses chatted on benches, their laughter carrying through open windows. Inside, a young doctor approached her, a man with bright eyes and a nervous smile. "Frau Keller," he said, "they say this hospital started because an American trusted a German nurse. Is that true?" She looked at him, her face softened by time. "Yes," she said, "and because a German nurse decided to be worthy of it." He nodded, thoughtful. "Then we must never lose that story." She smiled. "No, doctor, because it's not just our story, it's humanity's." That night, as the last light faded, she walked to the supply room one final time. The same cabinet stood there, polished smooth by years of care. She opened the drawer and touched the old stethoscope, now dull with age. Her reflection wavered in the steel. She whispered, "You trusted us and we never broke it." Then she closed the drawer, locked it gently, and left the key on the table. Outside, the river moved softly under the moonlight, carrying fragments of stars across its surface. Ingrid watched it until her eyes blurred. The bridge she had built, of mercy, of trust, of hands, stretched unseen across the darkness, connecting what war had torn apart. And somewhere far away, perhaps, Captain Whitman was smiling. The winter of 1961 came softly to Frankfurt, blanketing the city in a silence that was no longer haunted. Snow fell on rooftops rebuilt from rubble, on trams that rattled along streets once cratered by shells, on children who had never heard the sound of sirens. Germany had grown older and younger at once, older in wisdom, younger in hope. And somewhere beyond the hum of progress, in a modest hospital on the riverbank, a woman named Ingrid Keller prepared to say goodbye to the only life she had ever known. She was 70 now, her hair white as gauze, her back slightly stooped but her hands still steady. The hospital had expanded into a modern complex, new wings, tiled corridors, fluorescent lights that buzzed softly overhead, but she still preferred the old ward. Its wooden floors creaked under her step. Its walls carried the smell of carbolic and candle wax. Every morning she walked those halls before dawn, as she had for nearly 2 decades, listening to the rhythm of the waking building. The radiators hissed, the nurses whispered, the patients stirred. It was a heartbeat she had built from ruins. On her desk sat the same small cabinet, the one she had guarded through bombings, famine, and peace. Inside, wrapped in linen, lay the relics of her faith. Captain Whitman's letter, the first stethoscope, Sister Helena's medallion, and the medal she had received in Washington. Every object was worn by time, yet none had lost their weight. They were proof that trust once planted could outlive the hands that carried it. Outside, the world was changing faster than any of them could follow. The Cold War divided the map into halves again, and whispers of a new Berlin Wall drifted through the radio static. But in the wards of her hospital, Ingrid refused to let politics enter. Illness, she said, does not recognize borders. Either should we. Her younger staff, born after the war, sometimes rolled their eyes at her strictness. To them, her tales of Americans and field tents sounded like another lifetime. A black and white photograph from a storybook. Yet they listened when she spoke. They couldn't help it. There was a gravity in her voice, a calm born of survival. During her final year, she took on a young trainee named Greta Hoffman, a spirited 20-year-old with quick wit and endless curiosity. Greta followed Ingrid like a shadow, learning not only the science of medicine but the art of grace. One evening, while reorganizing the supply room, Greta found the linen-wrapped bundle in the cabinet. She unwrapped it carefully, staring at the old stethoscope, the tarnished metal. "These are yours," she said. "They should be in a museum." Ingrid shook her head. "They belong to the future, not the past." Greta smiled. "Then let me carry them when you can't." Ingrid looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "When you understand what they mean, not just what they are." That winter, the hospital received an unusual visitor. A tall man in a U.S. Army overcoat, gray at the temples, arrived unannounced. When he stepped into Ingrid's office, she froze. For a moment, she saw the ghost of Captain Whitman standing there. But it was James Porter, the young lieutenant she had trained years before in Frankfurt. He had become a colonel now, his face weathered, his eyes the same kind blue she remembered. "I was nearby on assignment in Berlin," he said softly. "I thought I'd see if my old teacher still runs the world." Ingrid smiled. "Only the part that fits inside these walls." They spoke for hours, the conversation winding through memories and silences. He told her how Captain Whitman had passed away the previous spring, peacefully in her sleep. "She kept your picture by her bed," he said. "Said you were her finest act of war." Ingrid turned away, her eyes glistening. "Then I hope she knows what she started never ended." Porter reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folded document. "She left something for you." It was a single page typed on yellowed paper. Whitman's words were simple. To Ingrid, "If the world ever doubts mercy, remind it that I once trusted a stranger and she made peace out of it." Ingrid held the paper like scripture. Her voice trembled when she whispered, "Then we were both saved by the same trust." That spring, illness found her. A quiet pneumonia that crept into her lungs, patient and unrelenting. For weeks she ignored it, still making rounds, still training Greta, still unlocking the supply room each morning. But one dawn she collapsed between the wards. The nurses rushed her to a bed, and for the first time Ingrid became a patient in her own hospital. The doctors wanted to transfer her to the new university clinic across the river. She refused. "I'll stay here," she whispered, "among my own." Greta sat by her side every night, taking notes on every symptom, every change in breathing. "You taught us to fight for life," Greta said one night. "Now you must let us fight for yours." Ingrid smiled faintly. "Every healer must one day surrender. That's how the next ones learn." Her fever rose. Sometimes she drifted into memories. The sound of rain on canvas tents, the faces of refugees, the echo of Captain Whitman's laughter. Other times she awoke to find Greta reading aloud from the notebook, Ingrid's rewritten oath. Hearing her own words in another's voice filled her with both pride and peace. "We will serve life, not systems. We will remember that trust once given must be protected more carefully than blood." On the final morning of April 1961, sunlight broke through the ward windows. Greta sat holding her hand as Ingrid's breath grew shallow. The old nurse opened her eyes one last time and whispered, "The Americans trusted us. Don't ever forget. Then with a faint smile, she was gone. The monitors fell silent. Outside, the bells of St. Bartholomew's rang for morning mass. Her funeral drew hundreds: doctors, nurses, former patients, even a delegation from Poland. A simple Red Cross flag draped her coffin. No military honors, no national anthem, only the hymn she had taught her staff during the cold winters. Blessed are the hands that heal. Colonel Porter spoke briefly, his voice breaking. She taught us that mercy can be an act of courage. She turned enemies into healers. If there is peace in Europe today, a part of it began in her hands. After the service, Greta approached the coffin carrying the linen bundle, the stethoscope, the medal, the letter. She placed it gently inside, whispering, "You said they belonged to the future, but the future began with you." When the lid closed, the chapel filled with silence so deep it seemed the world itself held its breath. Months passed. The hospital carried on as if guided by invisible hands. Greta took Ingrid's place as head nurse. She was younger, more modern, yet her eyes carried the same quiet resolve. She kept Ingrid's office exactly as it was: the cabinet, the notebook, the photograph of the American nurses in the field tent. On the wall, she hung a new plaque engraved with Ingrid's words: "Trust given, trust kept." In 1962, she received a letter from the U.S. Embassy. The Whitman Foundation had established a new scholarship for nurses in Ingrid's name, open to applicants from all nations, friend and former foe alike. The first recipient was a Polish student named Maria Nowak, granddaughter of Dr. Alexander Nowak. When Maria arrived in Frankfurt to train under Greta, she carried with her an old photograph: Ingrid and her grandfather standing side by side in the camp outside Łódź, smiles thin but real. "My grandfather said she taught him how to believe in medicine again," Maria said. "He told me, if you ever doubt your purpose, remember the German nurse who saved us." Greta placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then you are exactly where you belong." Years turned to decades. The world changed again. Walls fell, borders blurred, new wars rose and faded. But the hospital remained, its foundation laid in trust. Generations of nurses trained there, learning not just the science of healing but the faith behind it. They called it Keller's Law. Every life saved is an act of peace. In 1985, a film crew arrived to record a documentary about post-war humanitarian efforts. Greta, now white-haired herself, walked them through the old ward. The cameraman paused at the supply room, where the original cabinet still stood. Inside, preserved under glass, lay the stethoscope and medal. The film captured her voice as she said, "These were the first tools of peace in our country. They remind us that compassion needs no permission." That documentary aired across Europe, and once again the world remembered. Donations poured in. The hospital expanded into a medical university. Its entrance bore a new inscription in both German and English: "Founded on trust between those who once fought, sustained by mercy for those who never will." In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, Greta attended a memorial at the United Nations. During the ceremony, a small box was presented to her, a relic discovered in the archives of the Whitman Foundation. Inside lay a yellowed piece of paper, folded many times over. When she opened it, she gasped. It was the original note Ingrid had written decades ago: "We will heal even those who once harmed us." Below it was a new line added in Whitman's handwriting: "And those who healed will never be forgotten." Greta closed the box with trembling hands. In that moment, she felt Ingrid beside her, not as memory but as presence, as steady as breath. Today, the hospital still stands. The walls are white now, the machines hum, and the air smells of antiseptic instead of smoke. In a glass corridor that overlooks the river, there is a small exhibit dedicated to its founder. A photograph hangs at its center. Ingrid Keller in her gray uniform, a faint smile on her lips, a stethoscope around her neck. The caption reads, "The nurse who taught the world to trust again." Visitors pause there, sometimes in silence, sometimes in tears. They read her story, they see the relics, and they understand. Healing did not end when the war did. It began when one woman chose mercy over memory. In the corner of the exhibit sits a single chair. On quiet afternoons, young nurses sit there between shifts, watching the river through the glass. They say the water still carries her reflection when the light is right. A woman standing among ruins. holding a stethoscope like a promise. And if you listen closely, beyond the hum of the city and the pulse of the machines, you can almost hear her voice, calm, resolute, eternal. The Americans trusted us. We stayed worthy of it. Now the world must be, too. The river keeps flowing, the bridge endures, and the hands of healers in every nation, in every age, still remember her touch.